The autumn of 1878 painted the Cumberland Mountains in fire. Maples blazed scarlet against the grey rock faces, and the morning mist clung to the hollows like spirits reluctant to leave. In a cabin perched on the side of Blackjack Ridge, Sarah and Samuel Hutchins came into the world on a cold October night, their arrival marked by the screaming of a panther somewhere in the darkness. Their mother, Rebecca, died bringing them forth. Their father, Thomas Hutchins, a man hardened by years of scratching a living from the unforgiving mountain soil, looked upon the two red-faced infants and saw only the theft of his wife's life. He fed them, clothed them, and taught them what they needed to survive, but his heart remained a stone. The twins grew up wild as the laurel that choked the mountainside. Samuel was slight and quick, with eyes the color of creek water after a storm. Sarah was his mirror and his opposite, taller by half an inch, with the same grey eyes, but a fierceness that made grown men step back. They spoke a language between them that needed no words, moving through the forest like two halves of the same soul. By the time they turned 15, the twins knew every inch of Blackjack Ridge and the valleys that spread below it like a rumpled quilt. They could track a deer through Laurel Hell, call up wild turkeys, and find ginseng roots worth more than a month of their father's labor. Thomas hired them out to other families when work was scarce, and the twins would disappear into the mountains for days, returning with wages that kept the family fed through the winter. It was on one such trip, in the late summer of 1880, that they crossed paths with the Taggart brothers. The Taggarts, Eli, Jacob, and young William, ran a timber operation in the next valley over. They weren't mountain people, not really. They'd come up from Knoxville 3 years prior, with money in their pockets and ambition in their hearts, buying up land from families who couldn't pay their debts. They cut the old-growth trees, floated them down the river, and got rich while the mountain people got poorer. Samuel and Sarah had been hired to guide a surveyor through the high country, marking property lines for a widow woman who wanted to sell her dead husband's claim. The work took them near the Taggarts' main timber camp, a sprawling operation of rough men and rougher methods. They first saw the brothers on a Friday evening, as the twins were making camp near a spring. Eli was the oldest at 32, thick-shouldered and mean-eyed. Jacob was 28 and clever, always working an angle. William was just 20, soft in a way his brothers weren't, but trying hard to hide it. "Well, looky here," Eli said, emerging from the tree line with his brothers flanking him. "Couple of pups camping on our land." Samuel stood slowly, putting himself between his sister and the men. "This ain't your land. This is the widow Patterson's claim, and we're working for her." Eli spat tobacco juice. "Patterson's claim borders ours, boy, and I don't recall giving permission for trespassers." "We ain't trespassing," Sarah said, stepping beside her brother. "We're on the Patterson side of the marker." Jacob laughed, a sound like rocks grinding. "Bold little thing, ain't she? I like that in a woman." The twins had dealt with men like this before. The mountains attracted those running from something or looking to take what they couldn't earn honestly. They packed their gear quickly, planning to move their camp further up the ridge. But as they turned to leave, Eli grabbed Sarah's arm. What happened next took less than a minute but changed everything. Samuel swung at Eli, catching him in the jaw. Jacob pulled a knife. Sarah broke free and grabbed Samuel's arm, and the twins ran, crashing through the underbrush as the Taggart brothers shouted behind them. They knew these mountains better than any outsider ever could. Within minutes, they'd lost their pursuers in the maze of laurel and rhododendron. They made it back to the widow Patterson's place by moonlight, finished their work the next day, and thought that was the end of it. They were wrong. 3 weeks later, on a September evening, heavy with the threat of rain, the twins were walking home from the settlement at Copper Creek. They'd sold a basket of ginseng root and had silver coins jingling in Samuel's pocket, enough to buy flour, salt, and maybe some peppermint candy for their father, who had a weakness for it despite his stern ways. The trail home led through a narrow gap called Devil's Narrows, where the ridge walls pressed close and the path wound between boulders big as cabins. The twins had walked it 100 times and knew every turn and stone. They didn't see the ambush coming. Eli Taggart stepped out from behind a boulder ahead of them, a shotgun in his hands. Jacob emerged from behind, and William blocked the trail from the rear. They were trapped. "You little shits cost me a week's work," Eli said. "Had to waste time tracking you down when I should have been cutting timber." "We didn't do nothing to you," Samuel said, his voice steady despite the fear rising in his throat. "We just walked away." "You struck me," Eli said, touching his jaw where a faint bruise still showed. Nobody strikes Eli Taggart and walks away. Sarah felt her brother's hand find hers, their fingers intertwining like they had since they were babies in a shared cradle. "Let us pass," she said. "We got no quarrel with you." "Oh, you got a quarrel now," Jacob said. He'd been drinking. They could smell it on him. "And we aim to settle it." What came next lived in nightmare fragments. The first shotgun blast caught Samuel in the chest, lifting him off his feet and slamming him against the rock wall. Sarah's scream tore through the narrows like a hawk's cry. She threw herself at Eli, but Jacob grabbed her, his arms like iron bands. "The girl too?" William asked, his voice shaking. "Eli, this wasn't—" "Both of them," Eli said, reloading. "Can't leave witnesses." They shot Sarah while Jacob held her. The bullet entered below her ribs and tore through her insides. They let her fall beside her brother, and the twins' blood mingled on the rocky ground. But Sarah didn't die right away. Through the haze of pain, she heard them arguing. "We gotta bury them," William said. "We can't just leave them here." "Too much work," Eli said. "Nobody comes through Devil's Narrows this time of year except locals, and locals know to mind their business." "There's an old mine shaft up the slope," Jacob said. "Abandoned copper mine. We throw them down there. Nobody'll ever find them." Sarah tried to reach for Samuel, but her arms wouldn't work right. She felt hands grab her, felt herself being dragged over rough ground. Somewhere in the distance, she heard Samuel moaning. He was still alive too, still fighting. The mine entrance was a black mouth in the mountainside, half hidden by brush. The Taggarts dumped the twins at the edge of the shaft, and Sarah's hand found Samuel's. Their fingers locked together one last time. "They're still breathing," William said, his face pale in the fading light. "Not for long," Eli said. He put his boot against Samuel's shoulder and shoved. The twins fell together into darkness, still holding hands. The shaft was deep, 40 feet, maybe 50, and they hit bottom with a sickening impact that finished what the bullets had started. In the absolute darkness of that forgotten hole, Sarah Hutchins died with her brother's hand in hers, their blood soaking into the old copper-stained earth. Above, the Taggart brothers covered the shaft, opening with brush and rocks, hiding their crime beneath the mountain skin. They walked away, believing they'd gotten away with murder. They had no idea what they'd set in motion. Time moves differently in the deep places of the earth. Days and nights mean nothing when you're buried beneath tons of rock and soil. The twins' bodies lay where they'd fallen, slowly being claimed by the mountain. Their flesh withered and fell away. Insects and small cave creatures did their work. The dampness of the mineshaft rotted cloth and leather. Within a year, only bones remained, still arranged in the position of their final fall, Samuel's skeletal hand still clasping Sarah's. But something else remained too. The old people of the mountains, the ones who remembered the ways from before churches and civilization crept into the hollows, could have told you about such things. They knew that violent death, especially of the young and innocent, leaves marks on the land. They knew that twins who shared everything in life sometimes refused to part in death. They knew that unavenged murder cries out from the ground. On a October night in 1880, exactly 2 years after the twins' birth and 2 years after their mother's death, something stirred in the mine shaft. If anyone had been there to witness it, they would have seen a faint glow beginning in the bones, a cold phosphorescence like foxfire on rotting wood. The light grew stronger, pulsing like a heartbeat, spreading from bone to bone until both skeletons shimmered with eerie radiance. The skeletal hands tightened their grip, and then, impossibly, the bones moved. Sarah's skull turned towards Samuel's. Empty eye sockets blazed with pale light. Jaws opened in silent screams. The skeletons rose, pulling themselves upright through an act of will that transcended death itself. They stood in the darkness of the shaft, still holding hands, and remembered everything. They remembered the ambush, the bullets, the fall. They remembered the faces of their killers. And in that moment of terrible clarity, purpose flooded through them like ice water through dry bones. Revenge. The word echoed in the space where their minds had been. No longer thought, but pure intention. They would have revenge on the Taggart brothers. They would have justice for their stolen lives. But first, they had to get out. The shaft walls were rough stone, and though their bones should have been too rigid, too unarticulated to climb, the force that animated them had its own logic. They climbed as they had climbed trees as children, helping each other, boosting and pulling, bone fingers finding purchase in cracks and crevices. It took them hours to reach the top. When Samuel's skeleton finally pulled itself over the lip of the shaft, reaching back to help Sarah up behind him, a harvest moon hung fat and orange over the mountains. The world was washed in silver light and black shadows. The twins stood at the mine entrance, looking out at the forest that had once been their home. They could not speak. They had no lungs, no vocal cords, no tongue. But they didn't need speech. They'd never needed it. Samuel's skull turned toward Sarah's. She nodded, the gesture eerily human despite the lack of flesh. They knew where to find the Taggart brothers. The Taggart timber operation had grown in the 2 years since the murders. Eli had bought out 2 more family claims and expanded his crew to 15 men. They'd built a proper logging camp with bunkhouses, a mess hall, and a big house for the brothers themselves. The operation had made them wealthy. Eli wore fine clothes now, ordered from Knoxville. Jacob had married a girl from town and brought her up to the mountains, though she was already regretting the decision. William drank more than he should and had nightmares about the events in Devil's Narrows, though he never spoke of them aloud. None of them had forgotten the Hutchins twins. They'd heard that Thomas Hutchins had reported his children missing, that searches had been conducted, that eventually the old man had given up and moved away, broken by grief. The Taggarts told themselves they'd done what was necessary. The twins had seen too much, known too much. It was them or us, they said. But on nights when the wind howled through the camp, Eli would sometimes wake with a start, thinking he heard screaming. Jacob would check the locks on his doors twice before bed, and William drank to keep the memories at bay. The twins came for William first. He was the weakest link, the one whose conscience still bothered him. On the night of October 15th, he'd had too much whiskey and wandered away from the camp to relieve himself in the woods. The other men were used to his drinking and paid no mind when he stumbled off into the darkness. William was fumbling with his trousers when he heard it, a sound like dry sticks clicking together, coming from the trees behind him. He turned, squinting into the shadows. "Who's there?" he called, his voice slurred. "That you, Jacob." The clicking grew louder, closer, and then he saw them. They emerged from behind a massive oak tree, moving with an unnatural grace that made his alcohol-fogged mind struggle to understand what he was seeing. Two skeletons, walking upright, their bones gleaming pale in the moonlight. They still held hands, even in death. William's scream died in his throat. His mind, already weakened by guilt and whiskey, couldn't process what stood before him. He knew those skeletons, knew the height of them, the shape of their skulls. He'd seen those bodies broken and bleeding. "No," he whispered. "No, you're dead." "You're dead." Sarah's skeleton released Samuel's hand and stepped forward. Her bare feet, just bones now, metacarpals and phalanges somehow bearing weight, made no sound on the fallen leaves. She raised one bony hand and pointed at William, and though she had no eyes, he felt the weight of her accusation. "It was Eli's idea," William shouted, backing away. "I didn't want to. I said we should let you go." But the dead don't care about excuses. Samuel's skeleton moved with frightening speed, closing the distance in 3 long strides. His bone fingers clamped around William's throat with impossible strength. William clawed at the skeletal hands, his fingers finding only hard bone and empty air where flesh should be. Sarah approached from the other side. She moved behind William and placed her skeletal hands over his eyes. The touch of her bones against his skin was cold as January ice, and where she touched him, frost formed. William tried to scream, but Samuel's grip cut off his air. His lungs burned, his vision darkened around the edges. The last thing he saw was Sarah's skull leaning close to his face, her jaw opening wide, as if to speak words she could no longer say. They held him until he stopped struggling. Then they held him longer, until they were certain his heart had stopped. When they finally released him, William Taggart's body crumpled to the forest floor. His face was frozen in a rictus of terror, his eyes wide and unseeing. Frost still clung to his face where Sarah's hands had been. The twins stood over their first kill, their skeletal forms casting no shadows in the moonlight. They felt no triumph, no satisfaction. They felt nothing at all except the cold burning need for more. 2 more to go. They melted back into the forest, leaving William's body for his brothers to find. The camp found William's body at dawn. One of the loggers, heading out to check the saw blade before the day's work began, nearly tripped over the corpse. His shouts brought the others running, including Eli and Jacob. They stood in a circle around their youngest brother, taking in the scene with growing unease. "Heart must have give out," one of the older loggers said, shaking his head. "Drunk himself to death, likely." But Eli crouched beside the body, studying William's face. The expression of absolute terror, the frost that still lingered in the early morning chill, concentrated around his eyes and throat despite the relatively warm October weather. "Get the wagon," Eli said quietly. "We'll take him to the settlement for burial." Jacob pulled his older brother aside. "That ain't natural, Eli. Look at his face. He was scared to death." "He was drunk," Eli said, but his voice lacked conviction. "That frost on his face? Cold snap last night. His eyes, Eli. Look at his eyes. It's like he saw something." Eli grabbed Jacob's collar, pulling him close. "He saw the bottom of too many whiskey bottles, that's all. We don't speak of anything else. You understand me?" But Jacob wasn't the only one wondering. The loggers were mountain men, and mountain men knew when something wasn't right. They'd heard the old stories about haints and revenants, about the dead who wouldn't rest. By the time William was loaded into the wagon, half the crew was glancing nervously at the tree line. That night, 3 men quit and headed down the mountain. Eli raged at their cowardice, but even as he shouted, he felt the prickle of unease at the back of his neck. He ordered the remaining men to stay in groups, to keep the fires burning bright. He loaded his shotgun and kept it by his bed. Jacob sent his wife back to town. She didn't argue. The twins watched it all from the forest. They perched in the branches of trees like skeletal birds, silent and patient. They had time. Death had taught them patience. They waited 3 days, letting fear season their prey. On the 3rd night, when the camp was jittery and tired from sleepless watches, they came for Jacob. Jacob had always been the clever one, the one who planned and schemed, while Eli ruled through intimidation and strength. Jacob worked through manipulation and cunning. He'd been the one who suggested throwing the twins down the mine shaft. He'd been the one who covered the entrance with rocks and brush. He was also the first to truly believe that something unnatural had killed William. On the 3rd night after his brother's death, Jacob stood watch with 2 other men, a rifle across his knees. They'd built up the fire until it roared, pushing back the darkness. Every snap of a twig, every rustle in the underbrush made them jump. "This is foolishness," one of the men muttered. "Ain't nothing out there but raccoons and possums." "Then why'd you bring your Bible?" the other asked, nodding to the worn book tucked in the first man's belt. "Comfort is all." But as midnight approached, even the skeptical one's hand kept straying to his Bible. Jacob saw them first. They emerged from the darkness at the edge of the firelight, 2 skeletal figures walking hand in hand. For a moment, Jacob's mind refused to accept what his eyes reported. Then recognition hit him like a physical blow. "Sweet Jesus," he whispered. The 2 men with him turned to look, and their reactions were immediate. One bolted for the bunkhouse, screaming. The other froze, his hand clutching his Bible so hard his knuckles went white. The twins stopped at the edge of the firelight. They released each other's hands and separated, Sarah moving left while Samuel moved right. They began to circle the fire, their bone feet silent on the ground. "Stay back," Jacob shouted, raising his rifle. "Stay back or I'll shoot." Samuel's skeleton paused, his skull tilting as if considering the threat. Then he continued forward. Jacob fired. The bullet passed through Samuel's ribcage, between two bones, and buried itself in a tree beyond. Samuel didn't even slow down. "Holy Mary, Mother of God," the remaining man whispered, his Bible now open in shaking hands. "Holy Mary, Mother of—" Sarah reached him first. She moved behind him and wrapped her skeletal arms around his chest, pinning his arms to his sides. The man's prayers turned to screams. "Run!" Jacob shouted at him. "I'll hold them off." But the man couldn't move. Sarah's grip was like an iron trap. She held him while Samuel approached Jacob. Jacob fired again and again, each shot passing harmlessly through the skeleton. When the rifle clicked empty, he swung it like a club, but Samuel ducked under the blow with inhuman speed. The skeleton's hands shot out, grabbing Jacob's wrists. Jacob had always been strong, but the grip that held him now was something beyond natural strength. It was the grip of death itself, cold and unyielding. Samuel pulled Jacob forward, and the two fell to the ground together, the skeleton's weight pressing down on him. Sarah released the praying man, who immediately fled into the night and joined her brother. She knelt beside Jacob's head, her skull hanging upside down over his face. Her jaw opened wide, wider than it should have been able to, and a sound emerged from deep within her bones. It wasn't quite a scream and wasn't quite a wail. It was the sound of wind through hollow places, the cry of something that should not exist. It was the sound of rage and grief, given voice through bone and empty air. Jacob tried to close his eyes, but skeletal fingers pried them open. They made him look. They made him see what he had made of them, what they had become because of him. "I'm sorry," Jacob sobbed. "God help me, I'm sorry. It wasn't supposed to happen. We just wanted to scare you." But the dead don't forgive. They held him there, between them, as the fire burned down to coals. They held him as his heart raced faster and faster, driven by terror beyond bearing. They held him as something vital in his mind broke, unable to sustain the horror of what he was experiencing. When Jacob Taggart's heart finally stopped, the twins released him. His face held the same expression as William's, mouth open in a silent scream, eyes wide and staring at something beyond the mortal world. The skeleton twins stood over the body, their bone hands finding each other again. They turned as one and looked toward the main house, where Eli Taggart lay awake in his bed, listening to the screams. One more to go. By morning, the logging camp was deserted. The men had fled in the night, and Eli Taggart stood alone among the abandoned buildings, a shotgun in one hand and a bottle of whiskey in the other. He'd heard Jacob's screams. He'd heard the unnatural wail that had preceded them. And he'd stayed in his house, door barred, windows shuttered, listening to his brother die while he hid like a coward. Now, in the grey light of dawn, he ventured out to find Jacob's body by the dead fire. The sight of his brother's face, that expression of ultimate terror, confirmed what Eli had known since William's death. The Hutchins twins had come back. Eli wasn't a superstitious man by nature. He believed in what he could see and touch, in the weight of gold and the edge of an axe. But even he couldn't deny the evidence before him. The dead had returned, and they wanted him. He could run. Part of him screamed to do just that. Load up a wagon and ride for Knoxville, for civilization, for anywhere but these haunted mountains. But another part of him, the stubborn, prideful part that had driven him to build this timber empire, refused to flee. He was Eli Taggart. He'd carved his fortune from these mountains through strength and will. He'd be damned if he'd let 2 dead children chase him off. So he made a stand. He spent the day fortifying the main house. He boarded up windows, barred doors, and gathered weapons. Rifles, pistols, axes, anything that might serve as a weapon. He lit lanterns in every room, driving back the shadows. He built up the fire in the hearth until it roared. As the sun set, painting the mountains in blood-red light, Eli settled into a chair facing the front door, shotgun across his knees. He took a long drink from his bottle and waited. The twins came at midnight. Eli heard them before he saw them, that distinctive clicking sound of bone on wood as they climbed the steps to his porch. The sound stopped at the door. Silence stretched for a long moment. Then came the knocking. Tap, tap, tap. 3 slow, deliberate knocks, bone on wood. "I know what you are," Eli shouted. "I know what I done to you, but you're dead and gone, and the dead got no power over the living." The knocking came again, louder. Tap, tap, tap. "You were in the wrong place," Eli continued, his voice rising. "You should have stayed away from my land. It's your own fault what happened." The door shuddered. Something was pushing against it from the other side, testing the strength of the bar. Eli raised his shotgun and fired through the door. The blast tore a hole in the wood, but the pushing didn't stop. If anything, it increased. "Go back to your grave," Eli screamed. "You got no business here." But the door continued to shudder. Eli fired again and again until his shotgun clicked empty. He dropped it and grabbed a rifle, pumping shot after shot through the door and walls. The wood splintered, the bar cracked, and then silence. Eli waited, rifle raised, breathing hard. Minutes passed. Nothing moved. No sound came from beyond the ruined door. "That's right," Eli muttered. "That's right, you stay gone." The window behind him exploded inward. They came through the window in a shower of glass and splintered wood. Sarah's skeleton landed in a crouch, her bones clicking as they absorbed the impact. Samuel followed, dropping from the window frame with impossible grace. Eli spun, firing wildly. The bullets passed through ribs, through empty eye sockets, harmless as shooting at shadows. The rifle clicked empty, and Eli threw it at the skeletons before grabbing an axe from beside the fireplace. "Come on then," he roared, swinging the axe in wide arcs. "Come on if you're coming." The twins circled him, patient and methodical. They'd learned from their previous kills. They knew his weapons couldn't harm them. They knew his strength meant nothing against the implacability of death itself. Sarah fainted left, and when Eli swung at her, Samuel darted in from the right. Bone fingers grabbed the axe handle, wrenching it from Eli's grip with irresistible force. The weapon clattered across the floor. Eli backed toward the fireplace, his hand closing on a burning log. He swung it at Sarah, and for the first time, one of the twins recoiled. The fire made her skeleton shrink back, bones gleaming in the orange light. "Fire!" Eli laughed, a wild, desperate sound. "You're afraid of fire." He grabbed more burning wood, wielding the flames like weapons. The twins kept their distance, circling just beyond the reach of the fire. But Eli's supply of burnable wood was finite, and the twins had infinite patience. As the burning logs dwindled, the twins moved closer. Eli's back hit the mantelpiece. There was nowhere left to run. Samuel's skeleton reached out, and Eli struck at him with the last burning stick. But Sarah moved in from the side, her bone hand closing around Eli's wrist. The burning wood fell from his nerveless fingers as cold radiated up his arm. They had him. The twins moved in concert, their skeletal forms pressing close. Samuel's hands found Eli's throat. Sarah's hands covered his eyes, that terrible frost forming where bone met flesh. But this time, they didn't just hold him until his heart stopped. This time, they had something to show him. Through Sarah's touch, images flooded Eli's mind. He saw what they had seen in Devil's Narrows, the fear in their own eyes, the betrayal as men they'd done no wrong to murder them. He felt the bullets tearing through flesh, the agony of the fall, the slow suffocation as they drowned in their own blood at the bottom of the mine shaft. He felt Sarah's desperate grip on Samuel's hand as the darkness took her, felt the terrible loneliness of death unshared except by her twin. He experienced the 2 years of decay, of slow dissolution in the earth, of consciousness trapped in rotting flesh and then in bare bone. And he felt their awakening, that terrible moment of recognition when they realized what had been done to them and rose from their grave with only one purpose burning in their fleshless minds: revenge. Eli tried to scream, but no sound emerged. The twins held him, pouring their death into him, making him feel every moment of their suffering. His body convulsed, blood ran from his nose, his ears, his eyes rolled back in his head. When they finally released him, Eli Taggart collapsed to the floor. He was still alive, but barely. His mind was shattered, broken by the weight of what he'd experienced. He lay gasping, tears streaming down his face, his lips moving in wordless pleas. The twins stood over him, their skeletal forms illuminated by the dying fire. They looked down at the man who had killed them, who had stolen their lives and futures, and felt the cold fire of revenge finally satisfied. Samuel's skull turned toward Sarah's. She nodded. Together, they knelt beside Eli. Each placed one skeletal hand over his heart. The frost spread rapidly, ice crystals forming on his shirt, his skin, his eyelashes. Eli's gasping breaths slowed, stopped. Eli Taggart died with his eyes open, staring at the twin skeletons who had returned from death to claim him. The fire in the hearth burned down to coals, then ashes. Dawn light crept through the broken window, painting the scene in shades of gray. The twin skeletons stood in the center of the room, still holding hands. Around them lay the evidence of the night's violence: splintered wood, spent shells, the body of Eli Taggart frozen in death. Their revenge was complete, and yet they remained. Sarah's skull turned toward Samuel's. In the empty sockets where her eyes had been, a question lingered. What now? They had done what they came to do. They had claimed justice for their stolen lives. But they were still here, still bound to the world of the living by the force of their will and rage. Samuel's skeletal hand tightened on Sarah's. He moved toward the door. leading her out of the house and into the morning light. The sun was rising over the Cumberland Mountains, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. The twins stood on the porch of the dead man's house and looked out at the world they'd once called home. It was beautiful, just as they remembered. But it wasn't their world anymore. They were creatures of bone and cold fire now, held together by rage and grief. The living world would always fear them, always flee from them. They had no place here. Samuel began walking, and Sarah walked beside him, their skeletal hands still intertwined. They moved through the abandoned logging camp, past the silent equipment and empty bunkhouses. They climbed the trail that led up Blackjack Ridge, following paths they'd known as children. The forest closed around them, welcoming them back into shadow and silence. They walked for hours, climbing higher and higher. The sun moved across the sky, but they paid it no mind. They were beyond the concerns of light and darkness now. As afternoon shadows lengthened, they reached a familiar place, Devil's Narrows, where they had died. The twins stopped at the entrance to the narrow gap, looking at the spot where their blood had once stained the rocks. 2 years of rain and weather had washed away the visible evidence, but they knew. They would always know. Samuel turned away from the narrows and led Sarah up the slope, through the brush, to the entrance of the old copper mine. The rocks and branches the Taggarts had used to hide the shaft had been scattered by wind and animals. The opening yawned dark and deep. The twins stood at the edge, looking down into the darkness where they had lain for 2 years. This was where they had died. This was where they had been reborn as something else. This was where they belonged. Sarah's skull turned toward Samuel's one last time. If bones could smile, hers would have. She had her brother. She'd had him in life, in death, and in whatever strange existence they now inhabited. That was enough. Samuel raised their joined hands, and together, still holding tight, the twin skeletons stepped forward into the darkness of the mine shaft. They fell together, just as they had before. But this time, there was no pain, no fear. There was only the two of them, descending into the earth that had birthed them and claimed them. They landed at the bottom of the shaft, and as they did, the cold fire that had animated them flickered and dimmed. The purpose that had driven them from their grave was fulfilled. The rage that had held them together was spent. The twins lay where they fell, bone to bone, hand in hand, in the darkness at the bottom of the mine. And this time, they stayed. The story of what happened at the Taggart logging camp spread through the mountains like wildfire. The bodies of the 3 brothers were found, each bearing marks that no one could explain. The camp was abandoned, the equipment left to rust. No one would work there, no one would buy the land. Within a year, the forest began to reclaim it all. Thomas Hutchins, the twins' father, heard the stories eventually. He was living in Virginia by then, working as a farmhand, trying to outrun his grief. When word reached him of the strange deaths in the mountains near Blackjack Ridge, something stirred in his old, broken heart. He made the journey back to the Cumberland Mountains one last time. It took him 3 days to find Devil's Narrows and the old copper mine. When he looked down into the shaft, he could see nothing but darkness. "Sarah," he called into the depths. "Samuel, that you down there?" No answer came. But as Thomas stood there in the fading light, he felt something he hadn't felt in 2 years, a sense of peace. His children had found justice. They had found each other, and now finally they could rest. He gathered rocks and began filling in the shaft, working until his old bones ached.